Brainbar has talked a lot about AI, and that's for a good reason. Over the past year, everyone has been talking about ChatGPT, how amazing it is, how scary it is, and everything in between. There's a lot of conversation about the ethics of it, especially in education, like kids using ChatGPT to do their essays for them, what that means for what education is. Raise your hand if you're a student. Lots of you guys, nice. I am so lucky that I'm not a student now, because for sure, I would have been one of those guys who used ChatGPT to write his thesis for him. And then I would have gotten into lots of trouble. I actually had to do my work. I'm lucky. But coming up now, I'm gonna be having a chat with someone who saw the threats of AI in education, especially ChatGPT and other tools like it. And there were a lot of ethical implications, and he decided to do something about it. He created GPTZero, which is a tool that detects any text that was created by AI. That's impressive by itself, but he actually did it in 3 days. When I was his age, it took me 3 days to get over a hangover. He's a much more impressive person than I am. So we're very lucky to have him here. Please give a warm welcome to the wunderkid, Edward Tian, everybody. Have a seat, make yourself comfortable. Welcome to Budapest.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. I have one question for you. Just one question.
Yeah.
What the hell is wrong with you?
Great question. Well,
are you throwing students under the bus? Like, what's going on?
No. Okay, we're just gonna dial a step back and say that we are very student first. I was a student. A lot of folks that are using our tools and what we're building now are for this connect between writers and editors, students and teachers. So it's definitely, we're building for both sides. So hopefully not.
Well, okay, the timing is interesting though. Yeah. The timing is interesting because you graduated and then you launched GPTZero.
Very suspiciously.
The Roman Empire called that scorched earth.
Very suspiciously. I would say I definitely did this over winter break and then went back to school for another semester. I would say as well that these wunderkid titles are a little too much. We've been definitely looking at this for a while in terms of the technology, and maybe one other difference is originally education wasn't the purpose here with kind of AI detection in schools. I was a journalist for a year, and there were broader issues of AI being used by bad actors to generate misinformation in what we consume. And that was definitely the purpose. And then more and more we were talking.
Can you give me an example of that? Like, how is AI used by bad actors?
Yeah, 100%. So around in 2020, I was working for the BBC for a year, and we were looking at a lot of kind of election interference you can imagine in 2020. And already then, there were Twitter and Facebook bots that were AI generated profiles, text, everything. And you can imagine at kind of the end of 2022, I was already writing code in 2020 to detect those bots, and now they're like, wow, imagine those bots could chat with humans. That is like, holy shit, that's really, really scary. So that's definitely an example of what happened.
And what would these fake profiles do?
They would spam you, text you. They would just like auto-generate and reply to Twitter threads to spam everybody consistently. We were looking from everything from that amount of text they were writing, what kind of text, but also metadata in terms of patterns. So one example is there were bots that were sending messages 24/7 consistently without sleep. So if you plot their, like tweeting patterns, for example.
That's like Trump on Twitter, basically.
It is. Hopefully not the average human being. Hopefully we like sleep. I think there's like a sleep scientist at this talk, so we definitely want to promote that.
Well, okay, so tell me about the story of how you created GPTZero. What was the impetus? What was the process? Tell me about that.
Sure. So I graduated pretty recently, actually very recently, with a degree in computer science and journalism. On the computer science side, I was doing research with Princeton's natural language processing lab, the technology sort of underpinning the AI side on detection, and was just doing this with my thesis advisor throughout kind of the first half of the year. I would say over winter, kind of Christmas 2022, there was an impetus that no one was putting something out there. The scales were so tipped to one side in terms of the technologies that were being developed for generative AI, but not as much people were working on the safeguards to understand and adopt these safely. So it was the impetus that no one was putting something out there. So it was time for someone to do it. And I had this work on my laptop, so why not put it out there for the world to use? The bigger impetus has always been, for me, motivation in terms of integrity for the information people consume, both in terms of the news we consume, the journalism we produce, but also everyday information, social media, emails, a lot of that too.
ChatGPT in particular, I mean, there's a lot of tools out there, but
Yeah.
ChatGPT in particular kind of prides itself on being able to generate text that seems as though it came from a human. And when I've played around with it, it is a little bit sterile at times,
Yep.
and a little bit sort of, I don't know, careful. But essentially, it does seem like it would come from a human. So how did you figure out how ChatGPT works?
Yeah, so great question here. One is, for me, I had been playing around with this technology since 2021 and had basically worked for the lab since then in terms of the underpinning technologies behind generative AI. Two is, so in January, we were looking a lot at statistics in terms of writing patterns. So one example is that over time, there was a lot of variation in human writing in terms of syntactical patterns that we basically put out research where we didn't see those variations in ChatGPT over time. So that was one example of a pattern, as well as these stylistic writing patterns that we developed. And then as it evolved, now kind of AI detection is also evolving in terms of two spaces. One is we're building out the research and almost using the machine against itself in terms of having our own large language model like ChatGPT and seeing how likely it is to generate the same text and using machine learning to predict whether something was generated by machines. And the other side is there's a lot of research and development in watermarking and putting out metadata behind the text that's generated itself and using that as a pattern to be able to detect it afterwards.
So you're talking about the likelihood of repeating the same text, but I think in the way a lot of people write, especially if it's something factual like an essay or something, that has to be something that can be replicable. So if, for example, I take like a couple paragraphs of my thesis and I put it in there, which I did, by the way, it would tell me that there's 0% chance that this was generated by an AI. Cool. But everything that was in there, it wasn't necessarily in a personal writing style. It was a very academic paper. And I imagine that ChatGPT would write something similar. So what's the difference between what I wrote, which is kind of unimpeachable, versus something that ChatGPT would write, which is also similar?
So the difference here in terms of what you can detect now is for ChatGPT, it's very likely that given word ABC, there's some patterns where word D is likely to be generated with over 90% chance. Not because of this is what you're going to write or we know this, but because these large language models are ingesting gigantic data sets and then regurgitating these patterns that it has. So now if you can have kind of another like machine be able to find those patterns that are consistent for ChatGPT, but human writers don't know about, and really zone in on those.
But doesn't ChatGPT learn from human writers? So
yes, it does.
So how do you break out of that sort of weird feedback?
I would say one is you are not the collection of all human writers on the internet in the world.
Well, that's how I've always thought of myself, so thanks.
So there's the unique SID patterns, and then there's this collection of patterns that's unique to ChatGPT, and these collection of patterns that's unique to GPT-4, GPT-5, and whatever that's coming next, and BERT and Roberta and Llama as well. So they're a collection of all of these put together with a unique signature, and you are your own.
Yeah, but you did that. You did it in 3 days.
Oh, okay. Just to like dial back is like I had been doing the research with Princeton for over a semester, and then more generative AI work before that. And then the 3 days was building out a web app to launch it for the world to use. So taking that and putting it out there, I would say, is coding.
That's insane. And this was over New Year's?
This was over New Year's. Yes.
Party animal.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah.
So,
all
okay,
the
can you
time.
tell me why AI
Drinking code.
detection is important?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for us, it's looking at world we want to live in and enter, because there's not a lot of people that are properly incentivized right now to work on the technologies of detection and analysis. Generative AI companies, their model is to build AI generation and not AI detection. So it's a question of, do we want to enter a world where no one knows the authenticity and the origins of the information we consume anymore? And that's a little bit of a sad world too, considering a world where everyone's using only AI to write. Nothing really unique and original and different is being produced anymore. Or do we want to enter a world where we do know the authenticity of information? And for that, it's a world we want to create. So not only the origin of information, but it goes to this value of, do we value what's human? And can we work to preserve what's human in terms of writing, in terms of creations, in terms of content, everywhere? And that, I believe, is extremely important in the next turn of the year.
So you created GPTZero because you saw the threats of AI and the sort of risk to the humanity and preserving that.
Right, yeah.
How long did you play with these tools before the alarm bell started going off?
Yeah, well, again, I would say in 2020, I was playing with these tools, but they weren't mass accessible. They weren't open source models like Llama being leaked to everywhere as well, versus the turn of 22 to 2023, there was everywhere we saw, everywhere we read, the tools were there. So there was a risk that to teachers we're talking about and to writers as well. And remember, like I took a lot of writing classes in school as a journalist student too. It was a risk that people were talking about.
Were some of your colleagues or classmates, were they excited about the possibilities of it, or was it a sort of collective dread about the future?
I would say both, like 100% people were excited and everybody should be excited, and 100% everybody should try out these new tools. In fact, as a software engineer, I would use kind of the GitHub Copilot, the version of ChatGPT for code. Absolutely, we should be excited about the potential, but we should also build the safeguards at the same time.
So, because it's a new sort of shiny tool,
Yeah.
how do we use it in a responsible way? Because it's so easy when something's new and exciting and everyone's talking about it, it's sort of easy to get carried away with it. So what advice do you have for people to sort of rein it in?
Sure, yeah. I would say two pieces of advice. One is the pedagogical learning process of doing something yourself is still valued in the world. Two is disclosure with new tools like ChatGPT. We heard a lot about there's no proper way to cite and disclose these tools, and that's what we're building as well at GPTZero, kind of tools for students to really disclose and cite usage, to be transparent when and where people are using the tools. And that's the world we want to create. And I would say the last part is we've talked to so many kind of the business folks, the AI folks, and writers and everywhere after I've graduated, and value for human content still exists. And in a world that we create where valuing doing something yourself still matters, it's important to do things yourself first.
You mentioned citation of AI in your work. And
yeah.
When I was a student many years ago,
right.
We had to upload our assignments to turnitin.com, which would detect plagiarism and make sure that everything was cited properly.
Right.
Can you tell me the difference between how that works and how GPTZero works?
Yeah, totally. Well, I would say like increasingly plagiarism as a model is becoming obsolete because no one is plagiarizing when AI is there to be available to write things. And as we go past the year 2023, content on the internet is not necessarily human written anymore. So it's like, how do you verify content that's originally human? And for some of our tools, it's like, okay, we can verify that you wrote something yourself, and then you can put it in, or if you did use AI, you can says when and where and how many words and how you used it. And it's totally a different model than putting something in the copy and paste there. And I would say AI generation is not plagiarism. It's a totally different model and world we're living in, and I think people are excited to see there are total differences here.
Well, I mean, but they essentially have the same philosophy, which is that how much of this work is original, and where it's not original, is it sourced properly?
So I would say they don't have the same philosophy, because in plagiarism, you are taking someone else's work. Here, whose work are you taking? Versus it's AI. However, there's the same philosophy in terms of the AI is plagiarizing people, in terms of there's a lot of issues we should recognize in terms of copyright, in terms of generative AI, basically scraping the work of writers across the world and using it to train better models without that proper attribution.
Right.
So I would say it's actually not the human plagiarizing, it's AI plagiarizing here. So I think attribution's also a key piece here.
I tried GPT-Zero last week.
Cool.
Just to see, like, okay, so I'm going to be talking to this guy. Let's see his work.
It's like part of the job, right? It's like, okay.
So raise your hand if you've tried GPT-Zero. Well, you're going to after today. It's pretty cool. I did two things. One, I copy-pasted an entire BBC article into it. It told me this is 48% generated by AI, so bad BBC.
It's a prediction.
Fake news.
It's a prediction. I would say good BBC still.
But then
I worked at the BBC.
Yeah, worked. Past tense. Let's move on.
Okay.
But then I also copy-pasted a huge chunk of my stand-up into it. And luckily, it said this was 0% generated by an AI. That made me feel pretty good. So how long until GPT-Zero sort of worked out its bugs and its errors? Like, how long until it became a good, useful tool? Because I imagine it wasn't perfect right away.
No, definitely not perfect right away. I would say what's important in this space of kind of generative AI and AI detection and AI analysis is that it's constant improvement, that we have to keep up not only with the new models that are turning out. So after kind of GPT-Zero, for me, when I was developing it myself, was tuned directly for GPT 3.5 and ChatGPT's models. But now as GPT-4 was released, we saw, wow, actually, it wasn't as good for GPT-4. And we spent a week pretty much tuning it for GPT-4 and getting really good at detecting GPT-4 text, but there is that constant upkeep as well. So I would say this problem is far from over. In fact, it requires a really dedicated, awesome, smart team of people that is, I would say, our team now, and then to just like constantly work on it.
So tell me about how we can use AI responsibly in education, especially in classrooms from children, so not university students. A huge part of education is not just learning, but learning how to learn. So you're presented with a question or a problem or something, and then you have to figure out how to get an answer. This seems to the usage of AI seems to circumvent that. Can you tell me about how we can use AI responsibly in the field of education?
Sure. Do you mean more from like a teacher's perspective or a student's perspective?
Let's start with teachers. Like, how can this? I imagine it's sort of an existential threat to their profession as well.
Yeah. Well, okay. I can't speak for teachers in general because I'm not a teacher, but we have been talking to a lot of teachers, as you can imagine, in the past 6 months. I would say So we've seen that teachers, more than anyone, know that AI is here and it's going to stay. We have to give teachers a lot of credit. There's also a lot of leeway that we have to understand in terms of these technologies are so new, and for a lot of teachers, they kind of need the time to adjust to it as well. And we've heard from teachers that giving feedback is one of the most enjoyable parts of their job, and sometimes they've spent like hours giving feedback to a piece of work to realize that it was AI written, and that really cheapens the process. So there is a lot of leeway we should give there, but I think the overall understanding is that it shouldn't be teacher against student, but it should be teacher with student, and how do we build tools that bridge the gap. And the original plagiarism model, and why I had a little qualms with that, is that it's inherently about separating and putting a gap. But with both understanding when and where AI is used, that's inherently trying to bridge that gap closer. And with building tools for students to disclose AI usage and understanding how it could fit into the classroom, that's about bridging that gap closer. And I think that's the goal here. And not just for student and teacher, writer and editor, you and your coworker, you and your reader, you and your mom,
Right.
everybody.
And what about for students?
Same thing. How do you bridge the gap in this class?
So you're talking about it's not teacher versus student, it's
Right.
teacher with student.
Right.
So is it teacher with student versus AI?
A great question. Maybe teacher versus student, figuring out where AI fits in their lives.
What are your aims with GPTZero? Like, what does success look like for you?
Yeah, success looks like, one, building a world where people still value what was human-made. I think that's core to it. That's core to why we're doing this, why we're working on this problem. That's core to why we think more people should be working on this problem. Two is building a filter for consuming information that's freely available to everybody, especially with coming elections around the world, with more disinformation being what we wouldn't call journalism anymore, but AI journalism, just pumping out information, building a filter for information. I would say a filter in it's a two-way street. Information is two-way street. So both how we consume, but also how we produce, what we write, what we create, even things like articles or just emails too, and having the ability for people to stamp and verify that this was something I wrote myself too. Well, having that be ubiquitous.
I wonder if there's, maybe this is a couple years down the line, but on the BBC, when it's a sort of distressing news story or there's graphic images,
Right.
whatever, there's always a disclaimer at the top. It says, warning, this article contains language that some might find offensive, whatever.
Right.
Could there be a disclaimer like that in the future? Like, this article contains AI-generated text?
There could. I would say a lot of newsrooms are not very happy with AI usage in terms of how they've taken the content of writers and produced it, but a lot of newsrooms are very forward with it. Just last week, I was browsing and looking at Workday, and the New York Times have the new generative AI head of research position open now. So a lot of newsrooms are being very forward with it too. So totally.
What kind of pushback are you getting?
Yeah, in terms of one is to add, I would say we have to realize that this technology is not sudden and new. When I was giving this Workday head of generative AI job example, there are newsrooms like Bloomberg who's adopted AI technology in terms of writing and turning business news for years now, quite successfully. So it's realizing where things fit into place.
But I imagine that there's a huge quorum of AI fans and people who are absolutionists. No, absolutionists, that's the wrong word. But they're super fans, right?
Yeah.
They're diehards.
Totally.
And do they view you as a hurdle, an enemy?
I would say no. I would say we've talked to folks and worked with folks at both the companies that are training AI data and the LLM providers themselves. I would say there's some tension for, let's say, a big company like OpenAI between putting out more generative AI technologies and AI safety as well. But having GPTZero out there, from what we heard, has helped hold the bigger players and the bigger feet and their fish their feet to the ground in terms of, okay, someone's doing it, we better work on it too, let's set the bar higher as well. I don't think the majority of people are the AI diehards right now. I think more people are thinking about AI safety, but not a lot of people are thinking about it in a way where the incentives really align to implement it actionably.
No, so it's not that dramatic.
Not that dramatic.
Well, you mentioned OpenAI, and I have one request for you.
Yes.
Please don't sell GPTZero to Elon Musk.
Definitely won't. I don't
He's
think
going to
the-
call it GPTX. He's going to confuse
I
everyone.
don't think the morals and the mission and the values align there.
Good, perfect. Ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time, but Edward's going to be around, so if you'd like to have a chat with him, please do. In the meantime, please give it up for Edward Tian, everybody.
Thank you, Dave.
Genuine pleasure to have you here. Thank you.